also am looking forward to listening to the following panels as well. I wanted to just be able to speak a little bit to access and disability within this framework of breaking a canon, and what it can mean to envision those who have been in the margins to be able to come into the center of a discourse. When we think of breaking a canon, we're thinking maybe in many ways of breaking a physical manifestation of an oppressive ideological structure, of shattering this restrictive and oppressive phallic symbol. And so it's really exciting to be able to find ways of doing this with and for the people who have been pushed to the margins. And to then, when we're finally at the center, to be able to reimagine what it could be like to have forms of power that could then reframe this idea of there being a center that would exclude us. So that's what I'll say about this day. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from Alina as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Perel. I mentioned it yesterday in my opening notes, so Perel has joined at a quite late point of time myself in order to reflect a little on this Saturday's program, which I want to thank you for here, Perel. And I think we have had a really amazing exchange on margins, center, and collectiveness. And I think that I appreciate your input for this day, and I'm really looking forward to all of the contributions. I don't want to take up more of Kenny Freese's space, because Kenny Freese has been someone that has been on my mind when I first started thinking about this conference from the start. And I'm so honored, Kenny, that you accepted this invitation and that we can hear you speak today. So I will maybe go on now to Kenny Freese's keynote and introduce you. So Kenny Freese is the author of In the Province of the Gods, which has received the Creative Capital Literature Award, also of The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, which has received the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Awards, and Body, Remember a Memory. Kenny Freese edited Staring Back, The Disability Experience from the Inside Out, and his book of poems include In the Gardens of Japan, Desert Walking, and Anesthesia. His work has been published in numerous places, including the New York Times, Granta, The Believer, and Kyoto Journal. Twice a Fulbright Scholar in Japan and in Germany, he was a Creative Arts Fellow of the Japan-US Friendship Commission and the National Endowment for the Arts. And he received a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Arts and Literary Arts Fellowship, as well as a grant from the DAAD, Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, and Toronto Arts Council. And his current work in progress, which we were very much looking for and which Kenny has been working on for a long time, is Stumbling Over History, Disability and the Holocaust, excerpts of which are the basis for his video series, What Happened Here in the Summer of 1940, which I really highly recommend everyone to watch on Kenny Freese's website. It's all available there, and which focuses on Action T4, which was the Nazi program that mass murdered disabled people. And currently, Kenny Freese teaches in the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing program at Goddard. And Kenny has also been part of Perel's show here at Kampnagel Live, Unworthy of Life, last fall. So I'm very honored to virtually welcome you back to our program. I am very happy and honored you accepted this invitation, and I'm so much looking forward to listening to you and be speaking with you afterwards. Oh, I am so sorry, I missed one important thing for our audience. If you have questions to Kenny Freese, feel free to post them in the Q&A section here in the Zoom webinar. And if you're in the Vimeo stream, there is a telephone number in the description in the video below. And you can send your questions via text message or WhatsApp to that telephone number. And we will then be able to include these questions in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you so much.
Well, hello. As I mentioned to people before this backstage that I am, this is very early for me since I usually don't exist till at least 1 o'clock, but I will do my best. Thank you for that introduction and thank you for the invitation. And I've put together this keynote, which in true fashion for me, it's associative and it builds to the end. So if you get lost in the middle, don't worry, it'll eventually all make sense. Hopefully for those listening in German, for you too. So the keynote is called Metaphors, Bibles, and Canes on Recontextualizing and Creating a Personal Canon. And it's in a few parts. So this is the prologue called Koans and Mantras. From Body Remember, a Memoir. Those afternoons I did not take the bus and chose to walk home from high school, I would find this boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, sitting on the stoop of the semi-detached house where I imagined he lived. Every time I passed, this boy asked, "Why are your legs the way they are?" And I would answer, "I was born that way, never stopping or slowing down." The next time I walked down that street, there this boy was, sitting on the stoop, and again he asked me his same question, and I gave him my same answer. That was the entirety of our exchange. Every time I walked down Bay 43rd Street in Brooklyn, shortly after 3 in the afternoon, that boy and that question would be waiting for me. Never did I think of answering him in any other way, or not to answer him at all, nor did I ever stop to talk to him. And never did it occur to me that I could walk down another street, not see this boy, and evade his question. The questions the boy asked are not my questions, nor the questions I want my life or my work to answer, but the questions I am seemingly forced to answer by others, as well as by the historically scripted cultural narrative of disability. Thus, my life and my work is set against the received narrative of disability. As I write in The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, similar to its attitude toward homosexuality in our culture, demands explanations about most disabilities. The writer Joan Tollefson, who has one arm, has likened this question, "What happened to your arm?" to a koan mantra that follows her through life. When we speak of disability, we associate it with a story, place it in a narrative. A person became deaf, became blind, was born deaf, was born blind, became quadriplegic. The impairment becomes part of a sequential narrative. By doing this, we think of disability as linked to individualism and the individual story. What is actually a physical fact becomes a story with a hero or a victim. Disability becomes divorced from cultural context and becomes the problem of the individual, not a category defined by the society. The dialectic of normalcy, for someone to be normal, someone has to be not normal, is kept intact. 1, Canon and Canes. Canon, a rule or especially body of rules or principles generally established as valid and fundamental in a field or art or philosophy. A group of literary works that are generally accepted as representing a field. I never had a canon. There's never been a canon of literature about people with disabilities. Or, to be more accurate, the accepted canon of what I most wanted to write about was the opposite of the experience of my life. Canon is a word derived from a Hebrew and Greek word denoting a cane or measuring rod. Therefore, it means something straight or something to keep straight. Very interesting for a writer who both uses a cane and is decidedly not straight, as we have come to understand the word. It seems that I'm always coming up against a stereotype in conflict with itself. The term canon passed into Christian usage to mean norm or rule of faith. One of the meanings of the word in English is law or rule, which is the same in Arabic. Rule of faith. This makes me think of the Bible, which in the Christian world is perhaps the canon, to which much work and structures of life refer. But if my cane is related to canon, there is a long, often untold history. In the introduction to Staring Back, the Disability Experience from the Inside Out, the first multi-genre anthology to be commercially published in the US in 1997, I write about the canon of disabled people in literature, ranging from Sophocles' blind Oedipus and the blind prophet Tiresias, who is often depicted as queer, Shakespeare's Richard III, Dickens' Tiny Tim, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's Monster, and Melville's Ahab, all written by non-disabled writers, defined disabled people as cripples defined by excess, charity, or villainy. These characters were saints or sinners, the blind man who knows too much, the feeble-minded who felt too much and made us pity too much, the superhuman who achieved too much and inspired us, the greedy deformed by wanting too much. More recently, in the 1930s and 1940s in the United States, the canon of disabled characters expanded to include characters created by such authors as Nathaniel West, Dalton Trumbo, Nelson Algren, and Carson McCullers, characters that became stand-ins, metaphors, reflecting the values of being an outsider in society. In German literature, we have Günter Grass's The Tin Drum, 1959, narrated by Oscar, a dwarf who, according to Suzanne C. Knittel, narrowly avoids being killed in Action T4, a fact that has seemingly and significantly escaped the notice of most critics, who becomes a metaphor for the health of the body politic. Knittel writes, by and large, the ghostly presence of the victims of Nazi euthanasia in the literature of this period has gone entirely unnoticed by literary scholarship, or evolves around whether or not the characters conform to the critics' preconceived notions about disability. Later, we have characters such as Saul Bellow's William Einhorn, a character who survives because he, to quote Bellow, wouldn't stay a cripple. Einhorn, he couldn't hold his soul in it. Pop culture gave us Mr. Magoo, the affable man with a sight impairment who is the butt of jokes and ridicule, as well as the villains of James Bond films and Captain Hook in Peter Pan. The signaling of good versus evil by the addition of a hook or a peg leg or an eye patch. Introductory guides to screenwriting actually counsel fledgling authors to give their villains a limp or an amputated limb. Richard III and Ahab, Redux. In the 20th century in the United States, parallel to these fictional characters, we had real life disabled people, actual disabled people, who loomed over the canonical images of disability. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Helen Keller, who both re-inscribed the various myths of disability that still pervade our culture. One denied his disability, the other was defined by it. Interestingly, both FDR and Helen Keller became fictional characters in the disability-defining dramas and movies Sunrise at Campobello and The Miracle Worker. The seductive plot possibilities of the medical model of disability, its emphasis on overcoming and cures, are irresistible in creating conventional dramatic structure. Note, perhaps a parallel figure in German history might be Kaiser Wilhelm, who was born with a withered left arm much shorter than his right arm. Even the international art world supplied us with canonical icons, giving us Toulouse-Lautrec in late 19th century Paris and Frida Kahlo in mid-20th century Mexico City. However, because his life doesn't follow the trajectory of the canonical disability plot, notably missing from this starry array, at least until The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, is Henri Matisse, whose late in life disability led to his cutouts, some of the most luminous art of the 20th century, the creation of which is due to Matisse's disability, which did not allow him to continue painting in his usual manner. What tied all these canonical figures together was that non-disabled writers and critics who viewed disability from without perpetuated their images, defined by the gaze and the needs of the non-disabled world. 2, a book of myths in which my name did not appear. Cliché, from the French verb clicher, to copy, later to stereotype. In the summer of 1989, when I began searching for the words with which to begin speaking about my own experience living with a congenital disability, most of what I found was a canon filled with myths, metaphors, and lies. What I found were stereotypes. What I found were cliches. I began to take the initial steps of finding the language, unearthing the images, shaping the forms with which I could express an experience I had never read about before, so that my experience as a person with a disability could become meaningful to others. What I remember about that summer of 1989 is wanting to throw all those drafts away, not thinking them poems. Not having a role model in whose steps I could follow, unsure of my own identity as both a writer and as a person who lives with a disability, I felt like a shadow spirit, unable to meld successfully on the page the non-disabled world I lived in with my experience of being disabled in that world. Not only was I writing about my life as a disabled man that transformed this experience in which others, disabled and non-disabled alike, could see themselves, I was also writing about my life as a gay man. Being that a disabled man has been traditionally viewed as asexual, and that a gay man has been traditionally viewed as overly sexual, this was luckily a difficult stereotype to live up to. In 1994, I was invited to and participated in the historic Disability and Performance, a contemporary Chautauqua, organized by Vicki Lewis, director of Other Voices at the Mark Taper Forum, the large regional theater in Los Angeles. That April weekend, prominent artists with disabilities gathered from all across the United States to perform, read, teach, learn, talk, and get to know one another. That we had something valuable to offer was evidenced not only by an audience hungry to share our work, not only by the overcrowded classes, the sold-out performances, the TV cameras from CNN and public television, but also by the lasting, nurturing relationships forged by many of the participant artists. When leaving Los Angeles, I did not know that the writing I was exposed to that weekend would eventually form the core of Staring Back, the Disability Experience from the Inside Out, published in 1997. I had unearthed work that, once published, quickly became a canon of contemporary writing about disability by writers with disabilities in the United States. By this time, I had already learned enough and matured enough as a writer to negotiate the spaces between the double stereotype of being both gay and disabled. Body Remember, a memoir, the first memoir that looked at the life of a gay man with a disability in the United States, was also published in 1997. By this time, I had gravitated toward the work of Adrienne Rich. I noticed that in her Contradictions tracking poems, she was writing about physical pain. At the time, I thought these poems only metaphorically alluded to a physical disability. But attending a Rich reading in the Bay Area, I noticed the presence of her plain lucite cane. I learned that Rich was, in fact, disabled to severe arthritis. In diving into the wreck, Rich writes about a book of myths in which our names do not appear. Interestingly, Rich, a canonical US poet, feminist poet, and queer poet, had early in her career written more traditional poems. The poems in her first book, A Change of World, in 1951 chosen to be published by W.H. Auden in the prestigious Yale series of younger poets, have been described as tidy metrical poems. They were seen by Auden as neatly and modestly dressed, speaking quietly but do not mumble, respect their elders but are not cowed by them. By the 1970s, having published The Will to Change in 1971 and Diving into the Wreck in 1973, Rich had transformed herself into a poet Auden would not recognize. Critic Ruth Whitman says, Rich's transformation has been astonishing to watch. In one woman, the history of women in the 20th century, from careful traditional obedience to cosmic awareness, defying the mode of our time. In staring back, I proudly added Rich to my canon of disabled writers, which led to a nourishing acquaintance and correspondence, during which I became a role model vis-a-vis disability for the elder Rich. 3, a canon against canon. Often, works that reinforce dominant fantasies about oppressed people are inflated beyond their merit. Sarah Schulman. In music, a canon is a contrapuntal compositional technique that employs a melody with one or more imitations of the melody played after a given duration. The initial melody is called the leader, while the imitative melody, which is played in a different voice, is called the follower. Today, I see two distinctly different kinds of work being created about disability. The so-called mainstream continues to overvalue metaphorical or inaccurate depictions of disability. An egregious example is Nobel Prize-winning Jose Saramago's Blindness, first published in 1995, but now adapted into a pandemic-safe theater production, first in the UK and now in the United States. The persistence of depicting blindness, akin to the Greeks, as a metaphor in blindness becomes a contagion to be feared. Stephen Kazisto, author of The Planet of the Blind, writes, the latest version of this is a stage adaptation of Jose Saramago's novel Blindness, where the audience sits in complete darkness and hears a story of blindness as contagion. Yes, blindness as COVID. Presumably sitting in darkness adds verisimilitude. By God, brother, this must be what it's like. I'm here to tell you, blindness doesn't represent anything, and real blind people don't sit trembling in the dark. This play with its audience participation trick really troubles me. I've spent the last 30 years traveling the world talking about disability as lived experience. Disability is just like anything else, left-handedness, or having big feet. When it's metaphorized, it becomes a superstitious fiction designed to frighten the temporarily normal. Still with us are non-disabled writers and critics who, as I said earlier, view disability from without, perpetuate their images defined by the gaze and the needs of the non-disabled world. This is how the recent stage adaptation of Stefan Zweig's Beware of Pity, seen at Berlin's Schaubühne and across the world, can be staged with little or no mention of its problematic portrayal of disability. As an Australian critic writes, there is no doubt that the play is out of step with contemporary sensibilities. It would fail the Bechdel test for its representation of women, the Fries test for the representation of people with disabilities, and any other test you might care to administer. More on the Fries test in a moment. What a disabled critic might find in works such as Beware of Pity, how stigma affects both the stigmatized and the stigmatizer, goes unnoticed. What German state theaters have presented work by disabled writers? Another path is the work of disabled writers and artists who either write against the canon or ignore it entirely. An example of the former is US writer Ann Finger, who in Call Me Ahab, a collection of short stories that Finger calls fictionalized histories of disability, creates work using canonized figures such as Helen Keller and Frida Kahlo in Helen and Frida. A queer twist has them meeting and falling in love. And who in The Artist and the Dwarf refocuses Velazquez's canonical painting Las Meninas to centralize Maria Barbola, the dwarf depicted on the side of the painting. By doing so, Finger not only is able to tell the non-glorified story of the court of Spain's Philip IV, reeking in debt, but also is able to flash forward to the story of Leah Graf, the German-born dwarf who performed as the shortest woman in the world in the Ringling and Barnum Circus, and is most famous for the photo of her sitting in J.P. Morgan's lap. Graf, who in 1937 returned to Germany, where she was arrested by the Gestapo and taken to Sachsenhausen. In 1941, Graf, who was half Jewish, was deported with her family to Auschwitz and killed. Not only does Finger give us the reality of a disabled life in the 20th century, but by having Graf being drawn by a Jewish artist and fellow concentration camp prisoner for what will be medical reasons, she expands the meaning of Velazquez's famous use of the mirror in Las Meninas. There are many disabled writers, artists, and disabled writers, artists, and performers creating disability culture today. Carrie Sandall, director of the program on disability, art, culture, and humanities at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and director of Bodies of Work, a network of disability, art, and culture, says, many disabled artists I encounter are not aware of the complexity of what has come before. Sandall also points out that because of lack of education and training opportunities for disabled artists, many disabled artists often did not have and still do not have access to the wider cultural conversation inside and outside disability arts. She adds, once they know this, they could move to work that really interests them, which is usually not the what happened to you story. With all of this in mind, I created the aforementioned Fries test, which has 3 simple requirements. Does a work have more than one disabled character? Do the disabled characters have their own narrative purpose other than the education and profit of a non-disabled character? Is the character's disability not eradicated either by curing or killing? Today, I would add to the first requirement, do the disabled characters talk to each other? Tellingly, the recent Pulitzer Prize winning play, The Cost of Living, was lauded for the casting of disabled actors to play the two disabled roles. However, the two disabled characters do not talk to each other, and at the play's end, following on the most notable trope of disability characters, one of the disabled characters dies. Poet and New York Times critic Maya Phillips, though ignoring disability, recently writes, "There is a parade of queer tropes that seem to escape critique or interrogation. The Christian boys' school with the obviously closeted priests, the self-hating gay boy, the homophobic father, a fiance who is actually a beard, a tragic queer death. Such is the case for many works by traditionally marginalized writers that do somehow enter the canon. These works often, as Sarah Schulman says, reinforce dominant fantasies about oppressed people." I'll end my keynote with two short personal histories. For the past 7 years, I've been writing Stumbling Over History, Disability in the Holocaust, a book that looks at Action T4, the Nazi program that mass murdered disabled people, and its resonance today. During the 80th anniversary of T4, I pitched a story on the lack of knowledge about T4. The editor responded that he wasn't interested in publishing an anniversary piece about something that was not remembered. I had worked on the book proposal with a well-known editor at a prestigious New York City publishing house. When she brought the book to the publishing committee, the response was that the book should have less of me, the I who is narrating this history. Because I write hybrid books that are part memoir, part history, part travel, part cultural study, I'm used to such reactions to my work. However, as a friend pointed out, she was asking me to eliminate the I in a work about how hundreds of thousands of I's were eliminated. I'll end by asking a question I want to ask and hopefully eventually answer. How can a work be canonized that is about events and people who are not remembered? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Kenny. I feel truly overwhelmed. And I think that you have said so many things and intertwined them brilliantly with so many insights and references. Thank you so much for your work. I would like Perel to join the Q&A. Kai, could you please bring them up to the panel as well? Kai? Yes, okay, we have it. So I think many questions open up. Maybe Perel, you want to start off?
Yeah. Kenny, thank you so much for that powerful keynote in which you said everything that needs to be said. Really, really. I have a few questions for you that all kind of circumambulate around the same. Maybe there's like a central question, but many things that you've said circulate around this question. It's something that you have talked about in Life Unworthy of Life with me. And it's something that is part of your Stumbling Over History introduction. I think it's in the introduction, though I don't know, when you talk about Suzanne Knittle's Vicarious Witness. And when in this talk, you have talked about the lack of a role model in your own career. it was making me think of Knittel's vicarious witness theory, because, well, I was really struck when you talked about how in 1989 you considered throwing away your poems because you didn't have anybody to foster that or a place for them. And I wrote in my notes that you were writing into the void, but then you found a way to keep going and write your way into the world. And I was thinking about in your current manuscript, the role of yourself as a vicarious witness. And at the end of your talk, when you talk about how you were asked to eliminate the I in a book where hundreds of thousands of I's were eliminated, I was wondering if you could talk about the role of the role of being a vicarious witness in this most recent work of yours, and to maybe just propose how you would talk about that, not only in relationship to action T4, but to this lack of role models for you in your own life.
Yeah, do you have a couple of days? You talk about
I think
this
I just took a few days to ask you that question.
Well, let me take this apart a little bit. Well, let me just give a little background to Vicarious Witness for those that probably or might not know about it. So in her book, The Historical Uncanny, Suzanne Knittel talks about the fact that most of what we know about what happened in Action T4, since there are no Action T4 survivors, and even if they were, since most of them were had intellectual disabilities, they wouldn't be considered, I don't know, accurate witnesses or whatever word you want to use. Because we know what we happened by the perpetrator's statements and by medical records, that we need to find a way to bridge the silence by narrative means. And she calls this by being a vicarious witness. And the important thing is not to appropriate the stories of these people, but to come to it from various ways that she discusses. So that's what vicarious witness, that to give the context of that. Yes, I didn't have role models, but when I looked at Adrienne Rich's poems, there, besides this idea of connecting the pain to the pain of the body to the body's world, which is in tracking contradictions tracking poems, she also has some lines that really resonated with me, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the exact Rich's lines in front of me. But there's one poem where she talks about nobody has lived in this room without confronting the whiteness of the walls. Interestingly, now the whiteness of the walls would be considered even more than, because of the idea of color and the lack of writers and artists of colors in canons and so forth. But then I think she was really talking about the blankness of walls. And so I thought about that. And she also talks about something that, I mean, I still feel that in one of the poems, she talks about the speaker talks about waking up in a house filled with people still sleeping, which I still, being awake while the world sleeps, basically.
Whoa.
Yeah, and so that resonated with me very strongly. And then when I found out that Rich was in fact disabled and actually died because of her rheumatoid arthritis, it just really meant that she was in a lot of ways my first role model. And finding her was really essential. After she died, I wrote a piece called How Adrienne Rich Taught Me to Drive, the education of a gay disabled writer, that I talk about this. So I think that talked about some of what you said. I mean, I was very, very lucky when I was younger. I was in places because of my education. I was in places where I encountered well-known disabled people. In the faculty where I went as an undergraduate at Brandeis University was Irving Zola, who was a very early figure in disability studies, which wasn't called disability studies then. So that was very important of knowing him. And then soon after I graduated from graduate school and I moved to California, I became close with Marilyn Golden, who is one of the premier disability activists in the United States. So I kind of, I was very lucky that way. But interestingly, I didn't know disabled people. It was Irv Zola who told me to go to this, the Boston Self-Help Center, the Independent Living Center in Boston, which I did, and met a group of disabled people. But it wasn't enough for me to be friends with a disabled person because we had disabilities. I needed people who had the same, they were basically artists and writers. And through meeting Ann Finger and the Chautauqua, which I referenced in my talk, I started to collect disabled artists and writers. And without that, I don't know how my work would have progressed.
Maybe I can also jump in with one question that came up for me when listening to you, and also when listening to yesterday's panel, where the question of the unreliable narrator came up when we were discussing Schwarzrund's book. And this term came up in the context of a description of a scene of violence in a psychiatric institution. And the narrator was qualified as unreliable. And so when I received your draft for the keynote, Kenny, I have to admit, I Googled just to refreshen up my memory, this Günter Grass story and Oscar story. And interestingly, the first thing that comes up on Wikipedia when you Google Oscar is also this qualification as an unreliable narrator. And I was interested in that this term of literary analysis, which classifies narrators and characters as reliable and unreliable, on what terms, on what perception of truth or objectivity. And then you yourself in your keynote are speaking about a canon filled up with myths, metaphors, and lies. So I think that's really interesting to connect when we see how disabled characters are qualified as unreliable narrators, while the depiction of disabled characters in literature by non-disabled authors is itself full of lies and at the same time taken for truthful. So maybe you could comment on that a little more.
Well, yeah, my first thought is, I mean, if you take the prototypical, let's just say a white, straight, non-disabled author, right? They're telling lies too. It's just that everybody agrees with those lies. Yeah. So there's no pushback against it. So then we're back into the whole thing of like, is all art lies? But I mean, I don't want to go there. We could have a whole conference on that. That's next year. We could do a conference called "Is All Art Lies?"
Well, I actually wanted to ask you, because you talked about verisimilitude, right? And that it's necessary for that, for a disabled verisimilitude to be able to be used by non-disabled writers to like re-inscript, is that the word I'm even looking for?
Re-inscribe, yeah.
Re-inscribe,
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. These myths, lies, and metaphors, right? I don't know. I think I'm just observing that I was really struck by that word. And it's something that it's like, as a disabled artist, I notice in those narratives, but it's very hard to point out why it's violent, why it's an act of violence. But then you named it, I think. Right.
What's so interesting to me is that the thing I say about the production and the book, Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig, I mean, the portrayal of disability in that book and then subsequently in the stage production is egregious. But if you don't, it exists. And so when I was reading the book, I was totally mesmerized, because there was something in that book that I did not see in any other thing I've read about how the stigmatization of the disabled woman in the book also just ruins the main character who is not disabled. And what we forget is that the damage done by the stigmatization is, yes, it's, we can't measure things, right? Of course, it's more violent against the disabled person or the person who's being stigmatized, but it doesn't allow the stigmatizer to get off scot-free. But they don't know that. That's the advantage that we have looking at this. I mean, I could see that so clearly as I read this, and I looked and I looked and I looked for critical comments about the book, about the stage production. Nobody gets it. And, and that's a real big loss, because I could teach that book in a disability studies class. I wouldn't do it in an introduction, but people that knew the theory, that knew how to deal with it, and we could get to this place which not many other books get to. So I don't want to throw the book out. I don't want to throw the stage production out. I just wish there was more valid context to it. Because what we get in literature, it's not only, I mean, there are some, I can think of one non-disabled author that kind of gets disability. It's Catherine Dunn, who wrote Geek Love. And though there's some problems with it, with the main character, Olympia, who has a tail. This idea that you don't get the news from reading these books, as Muriel Rukeyser would say. You basically get a metaphor, you get a lie, you get a stereotype. You don't get what it is actually like to live an embodied life as a disabled person who is oppressed and marginalized in society. You don't get that. Mm. And that's the problem. And I'm not saying to eschew and to get rid of metaphor. And what I always tell my creative writing graduate students is that a metaphor has to be actual for it to work as a metaphor. So you can't just have this disembodied scar. Because one of my famous poems, Body Language, is about a scar, and I use the metaphor, but I embed it in a real situation. The scar is real. It's not just this thing that exists in the space. And you have to have it actual before it actually works as a metaphor. Mm. So you can't, metaphors are great. It's just it's how you use them, and the awareness of the context of them. In another talk, I give the two examples that from my work about how, in my poem Body Language, and also there's a part in The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory where my whole house becomes, everything I notice is an adaptation. I had just rafted down the Grand Canyon with a group of disabled people, and I realized that boats are an adaptation. And then in my house, the toaster oven, the couch, everything we have is an adaptation. Mm-hmm. And I bring in Henri Matisse at the end of that and talk about his story of the cutouts, and his experience of disability at the end of his life was very, very interesting, because it wasn't this negative thing. And unlike FDR, there are tons of pictures of Matisse in his wheelchair. There's only one photo of Roosevelt in his wheelchair.
It's wild, because when I learned about why Matisse moved to cutouts, I remember it. I wouldn't have thought about it unless you mentioned it in your talk. But I remember in a class as a child, like, seeing slides or something of his work, and then the cutouts later. And I asked about it, or maybe I have to say, I might not have asked, somebody else in the class asked. And I remember, though, the teacher saying it was because he had to do that, because it was, he didn't have the strength for his paintings.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is he did do things similar to cutouts earlier. And so there are critics that say it really wasn't because of his disability. So what's interesting is there's so many photos of Matisse in his wheelchair with his assistants doing the things that he could no longer physically do. So it's also a whole story about interdependence as well, and not the the great artist who does as a singular genius, et cetera, and so forth. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, it took me a while with Matisse because the misogyny is there and all that other stuff, the odalisques and the Orientalism and stuff. But that what happened at the end of his life and what he said, I wish I had a copy of my book right next to me. Well, what he said about being disabled later in life, it was almost freeing, he talked about, which is really fascinating. And that he could, deal with the radiant, not blinding light of this part in his career. So yeah, it's a fascinating story. Not yet really told by a disabled art critic. I'm waiting for that.
I wonder if we have time for one more question. I'm just looking at the time right now because the next panel will already start in 5 minutes. So Perel, I leave it up to you. Do you want to ask one more short question or should we finish here?
No, I feel like this is a good place to finish.
Okay, and don't worry, for the audience, you will meet Perel again really soon in 5 minutes on the next panel. So I think we can, we can end this keynote here. Thank you so much, Perel, for joining in the Q&A, and for Kenny for this amazing, I really don't know how to describe it. Thank you so much for the knowledge and the poetry you have given to us today. I appreciate it so much. And I thank you for being here, and I wish you a great day.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Kenny.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.